Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. I am so thrilled to be here with chef and baker Erin Jeanne McDowell. We've been talking for the last 15 minutes, and I know you're just going to have a blast today with us. So she is going to be doing a demonstration of pie dough, I believe, and then we're going to have a good amount of time for a Q&A, and I already have lots and lots of questions. So be ready, Erin.
I'm ready.
Okay, great. So just quick couple things. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. I would like to thank Erin, one, for being here, two, for letting us share this program with libraries. I have never had so many libraries jump onto a program as fast as they did this one. So,
that's so great.
I will put a list of all the libraries participating today. And I appreciate all of the fans and that Erin brought in, as well as all of the patrons from all of those libraries, including Ashland. So you can buy signed books from Erin from Aesop's Fable. I will put a link to that also in the chat. And you can, of course, buy them from any place that's local to you. But signed books are gold, especially during the holidays. So welcome, Erin. We are so excited, like I said, to have you here. There's a couple things I just have to say about you. One, you've been cooking and baking since you were 14 years old, and you've been all over the food scene, which is amazing. But I want to know, were you actually a judge on Nailed It, or had some aspect of Nailed It in your life?
I was. In fact, because of the time that this was released, I don't know that this made it out there in the zeitgeist as much as it should, but you can stream it on Netflix. It's 10 episodes. It was a spin-off of Nailed It called the Big Nailed It Baking Challenge. And I've been approached for a long time to do television, but and people who know me will understand this immediately. I did not want to be a judge and send somebody home for their baking, because that is not my style. I am very much like, all baking is welcome here. So this was a really cool role because I actually got to be a baking mentor. And each week, another coach and we taught a different skill that then they were, challenged with in a new competition, and so on and so forth. And at the beginning, they are frosting cakes with their hands. And by the end of it, they are making elaborate sculptured. It really worked, teaching them those fundamental skills. It's a really, really fun watch, very family friendly, a good binge watch for the holiday season.
I would love that, because I would always watch Nailed It, and I was like, oh, those poor, they got a little bit better, but there was no teaching, which was really nice.
Exactly. So, it was so fun to do that and it wasn't just laughing at the failures anymore. We also got to watch some serious improvement. It was very, very fun.
I love it. So I'm going to tell people to put your questions in the Q&A, and after Erin's demo, I will ask those questions of her, as many as we can get to in the time that we have. So Erin, please tell us more about yourself, because the Nailed It was my question. Tell us more about yourself, and let's go right into pie.
Definitely. So thanks so much for joining us today, everybody. And again, my name is Erin Jeanne McDowell. I'm a cookbook author. I've written 3 books. And it's winter and it's getting dark early, and my brain isn't functioning the same way anymore because I only have 2 of the 3 books over here. But that doesn't mean that I love the 3rd one any less. It's just all the way upstairs. My first book was called The Fearless Baker. It has a purple cover, and it's sort of a good general baking guide. My second book is a New York Times bestseller. It's called The Book on Pie. I am most known for pie, which is why I want to talk about pie dough today, because 'tis the season. Thanksgiving is sort of my Super Bowl season, but I'm pieing all year round. So I hope you guys are ready to still talk pie, even though Thanksgiving's a few weeks behind us.
Wait. So is Pie Day a big day for you too?
Definitely. So November, and then also March 14th, Pie Day.
Got it.
I usually do a lot of interviews around that time, lots of radio and NPR's calling up around that time wanting to talk about pie. So it's a nice, and I really enjoy that random day in March, because March is it's fun to have a random excuse to bring pie back. And then my most recent book is called Savory Baking. It still has some sweet recipes in it. I call them sweet tooth breaks, but that one is really fun. And it's sort of about translating a love of baking to every meal of the day. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, and lots of snacks too. I'm a food stylist also, so I've spent years just making food look pretty for magazines and cookbooks, and now I mostly work on my own books. And I also have this web series that I'd love to shout out for everybody. It's called Bake It Up a Notch. It's a free resource. You can stream it for free online on YouTube. It's on Food 52's YouTube channel. And something I'm very excited to announce is I'm also launching my own YouTube channel where there will be even more free content, free recipes, tons of stuff coming your way. So you can actually head to that YouTube channel now if you search my name on YouTube, and you can subscribe. So please do that because your support means everything. So excited that we can all support libraries together tonight. I have 2 librarians in my family, so we're big fans of libraries. So I am going to, sometimes during this demo, I'm going to switch to an overhead camera just so you guys can see what my hands are doing. And then I'll switch back, and you'll just have to bear with me because I do this with my hands. So I will also have to rinse my hands before we start our Q&A. But I've got you here in my ear, so I should still be able to hear you no matter what. I normally teach pie dough in about an hour. And what I mean by that is I help people break it down. I will give someone a private tutorial one-on-one. And even though it's very simple, it only takes about an hour. But we can give a great demo of it in way less time than that, which is what I'm going to do today because I want to leave plenty of time for all of your great questions. So I'm going to switch to the overhead camera, and we are going to start making the pie dough now. You can find this recipe actually in all 3 of my cookbooks, but you can also find it online. It's available on New York Times Cooking. It's available from the Washington Post if you subscribe to either of those, or it's available for free at food52.com. It's called All Butter Pie Dough. And that was very intentional because there's a lot of butter pie doughs on the internet. So we wanted ours to stand out. So we call it All Butter, baby. So I'm just stirring a 1/4 teaspoon of salt into 1 1/4 cups or 150 grams of flour. Since I'm a baker, I love baking by weight measurement. It's the most accurate. And then here I have a stick of butter. It's cold butter from the fridge. And I'm just going to show you how I cut the butter into cubes. I get asked this a lot, actually. So I just use a bench knife or a bench scraper. That's what this tool is. Of course, if you don't have this, you can just use a regular knife of any sort. But this is really great because it's not actually that sharp. So even when we're working with something slippery, we don't have to worry about slipping and cutting ourselves. And it's also as long as the stick of butter, so it makes cutting it really easy. I'm going to cut it in half lengthwise, and then I'm going to rotate the stick to a side where I haven't cut it yet and cut it again. Basically, we're cutting the whole stick into quarters. Okay, so you can see that here. I've cut it kind of into quarters. I'm now just going to go down the stick and cut it into cubes, and they're going to be about 1/2 inch in size. You don't need to be exact. They don't need to be identical. We're going to break them up into little pieces, but the goal is that they should look kind of like this. Okay, now I'm going to bring my bowl in front of me. I like to mix pie dough by hand. There are also tools you can use. One tool is called a pastry cutter. It looks like a series of wires attached to a handle. In fact, why tell you what it looks like when I can show you? It's right here. It looks like this, like that. This is wonderful, especially if you have warm hands, because you can actually refrigerate or even freeze this tool before you start working. That'll buy you a little extra time. We want everything to be really cold throughout the process of working with pie dough because that gives us the best results in the oven. If the dough warms up too much, the butter basically combines in with the flour rather than kind of being strewn throughout it. Somebody in the comments is saying that they use shortening in their pie dough recipe and they use the food processor. That was the next thing I was going to say. It is also possible to make pie dough in the food processor as well as using this tool. My main problem with the food processor is it incorporates the fat more into little pellets throughout the dough. Whereas working it by hand, we're going to be able to create these large, flat shards. These thin, flat pieces distributed throughout the dough are really what's going to make us have a flaky dough in the end. The idea is when we have multiple thin pieces of fat strewn throughout the dough, kind of layered throughout the dough, when that chilled fat hits the heat of a warm oven, the moisture content in that fat evaporates and it creates a little puff of steam. That steam physically pushes the dough kind of up, and that's what gives us that light, flaky layers. Now, the more we incorporate the fat into the dough, the less flaky it will be. So flakier doughs typically have larger pieces of fat. And then when we incorporate it more finely, like we might when we use the food processor, we end up with a slightly denser dough. And now I want to be really clear about this. Denser does not mean not tender. You know, it's more like just a little bit less airy, more like maybe a pie dough that you would have from the grocery store. It still is a nice tender crust. It's crisp. There are things about it that we like. It's just not that super flaky crust. And if you've ever seen any of my posts on social media, you'll know that I am known for a crust that sometimes looks almost like a croissant on the side. Someone just asked if I was using salted butter. I actually use unsalted butter typically. That may have been a stick of salted butter just now, and that'll be okay. Just to be clear, if you want to use salted butter, it's completely fine to use salted butter in pie dough. You just might want to add a little less salt. I have a lovely butter sponsor, Tillamook, out of the West Coast. They're out of Oregon, and they send me butter every month, and I just wasn't paying attention, and I may have grabbed a stick of salted butter, so I'm just trying to be real with you guys. This dough will be perfectly fine, even if it's a little extra salty. And yes, I am using all-purpose flour. Now, you're going to notice there's no other ingredients in here, except the only other ingredient we're going to add is water. I don't add sugar to my pie dough, but you can. I just like being able to use the same dough for both sweet and savory pies. And I also like, one of the things I love about pie is that it's not too sweet. So I just don't want to necessarily add more sugar here. That's a personal preference. For this amount, you can add 1 to 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar, and that would be completely fine. Just for people that are asking about the recipe, if you do Google my name and pie dough, this recipe will come up for free online from a lot of places, and it is in all 3 of my books as well. Someone's asking about unbleached versus bleached flour. Both work. I've tested them both very carefully, so it really doesn't matter. I'm using bleached flour tonight just for reference. Okay, so now I've mixed this in for a while, and you're going to see a lot of pie dough recipes tell you to keep mixing until the fat is about the size of peas or smaller. Okay, so that would sort of be what's happening in this hand right here. Okay, we've got some pretty small pieces of fat. Now over here, you see we've got some bigger pieces, and this is what I usually recommend for a lot of my flakier doughs. We're looking for pieces that are more akin in size to walnut halves. So walnut halves are give us that really nice flaky dough. And again, I see someone mentioning the food processor. I am a big believer that there is not just one right way to do things, and making pie dough in the food processor definitely works. But when you make it in the food processor, you end up getting more like little pellets that are round instead of these larger flat pieces. And just trust me, from many years of pie baking, it does make a difference. Now, with that said, you can get a delightful texture with the food processor. My pâte brisée recipe that is in my most recent book uses the food processor, and it is a wonderful dough. So it's just really a reminder that how we mix in this fat, the way, the size that we take it to, those are all going to impact the final texture of the dough. So if you want that really light, flaky dough, you can also just leave it a little bit bigger. If you love a reliable, easy to work with dough, you can mix that fat in very fully, and it's going to still be so delicious. I'm going to start adding water into the dough now. And I want to I'm going to bring it back up to my face just to give you guys one little lesson, because I don't want to have you staring at a bowl while I tell you this. Hydration is one of the most important things about pie dough. It's definitely the most misunderstood. It's where I help people troubleshoot the most issues. The reason I love to mix pie dough by hand is because you really get a feel for it at every stage, especially the hydration. It's one thing that I don't love about the food processor. Even when I use the food processor, I still add the water by hand because water can really get trapped under that blade and in some of the nooks and crannies of the food processor. And hydration is a very fine line, okay, guys? What I mean by hydration, a dough should completely come together. There should be no visible dry floury bits. That would be an indicator that it's too dry. And there should also not be visible stickiness to the touch. If I put a dry, clean hand on the dough and it comes up with dough sticking to it, it's usually a sign that it's going to be a little bit too wet. A too wet dough might even seem okay while you're working with it, but after you bake it in the oven, it will be very crisp, almost like a cracker, very tough. If you've ever had a pie dough where you can't get the fork through it, most likely you overhydrated that pie dough. Now, underhydrating dough is a little bit more difficult to work with on the front end. It becomes harder to roll out the dough. One of the most commonly asked questions I get is, how long do you let your pie dough sit out on the counter before you roll it out? A good, well-hydrated pie dough should be able to be rolled out directly from the refrigerator. It should not be so firm and hard that it's difficult for you with a rolling pin. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. There's also one tricky thing here. I have a great friend who writes wonderful books. Her name is Stella Parks. She wrote the incredible baking book, Brave Tart. You might be familiar with it. And her pie dough recipe is a really wonderful one. She really knows what she's doing. She has kind of cracked a code where she provides one solid amount of water that you have to add to the recipe. Now, a lot of recipes, including mine, use a dreaded phrase, okay? No one likes this phrase, plus more as needed. What is that? How do I know what is needed? I hate, as a recipe writer, I hate writing that phrase because I want to be able to tell you how much to add. But there's a reason that I don't. Unless I'm going to tell you a specific brand of flour to use, every type of flour, even if it's all unbleached, all purpose, or it's all bleached, different brands hydrate differently, different varieties hydrate differently. The story I always tell is that my mom uses a brand of flour that is milled in Kansas, which is where she lives. And because it's milled in Kansas, it's very inexpensive to purchase it. It's called Hudson Cream flour. And even though over the years I've said, oh, my favorite flour brand is this or that, my own mother is not going to switch brands of flour. That is what she's using. So I'm trying to write this recipe that no matter what type of flour you're using, you can get the right hydration. The problem is, unless I tell you a specific brand, like my friend Stella does, I can't give you a specific measurement for the moisture. So that's why we have to use those dreaded words, plus more as needed. We're going to start by adding about 3 tablespoons or 45 grams of ice water to our bowl here. But we will need a little bit more than that. And I'm just eyeballing it here, but I would encourage you to measure it, actually have your teaspoon or your little scale here to measure. And I'm starting by tossing the dough. I'm tossing because I'm just trying to distribute that hydration. And then this is the first thing that happens. We start getting these clumps that have formed. In these cases, the hydration has already started, like this piece of dough has become hydrated, but there's also a lot of moisture here and still a lot of dry powder down here. So what I'm going to try to do is break up some of those pieces, just breaking up that moisture just to make sure that I'm distributing it as fully as possible and that we're not getting kind of some pieces that are wetter than others. Someone is asking if location affects hydration. Absolutely. All different kinds of factors can do that, but one very extreme example is I have a friend who's an amazing pie baker in the Philippines, and because of the intense heat and humidity there, making pie is a very different experience for her there, and she has to add significantly less moisture just because of moisture in the air. So that's a really good point, whoever brought that up. Someone asked if it needs to be ice water. No, it doesn't. It just needs to be cold. So there doesn't have to be ice in it, and we don't want the ice, if there is any in here, to get in here, because then it will melt and it's going to throw off that hydration. So as long as it's really cold, in the summer, I always put ice in the water because I'm already battling intense heat, but it's pretty cold in my house tonight. So I'm okay just kind of leaving it with cold water. Okay, so I've now got to this point where I can see that it's starting to hydrate, because for one thing, this is a little bit more difficult to tell on my Zoom camera, but it's changed colors a little bit. You know, it was whiter before, and now it's becoming a little more yellow as it's becoming hydrated. So now that I've been tossing it for quite a while, I'm going to start to knead it. Now, I only want to knead it a couple of times to get a sense of if the dough is holding together. Now, this is what usually happens when you start to knead it. A portion of the dough comes together really easily, and a portion of it sort of stays powdery in the bottom of the bowl like this. So what I like to do is actually just remove that piece that's already come together pretty well, and I'm just going to add hydration to this part that still needs it. And I'm at a very fine point where I don't need much more liquid here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to dip my hands into the ice water, and I'm just going to flick a few drops from my hands into the bowl. And then I'm going to just stir that to see how it comes together. I might need one more drop, I can kind of tell. And then as that comes together into kind of a mass, see, I can see that it's cleaning up the sides of the bowl. We can just incorporate the rest of our dough back into it, give it just a couple of kneads, and we will be there already. Someone's asking if the yellow color is because of the butter. Yes, a little bit. Like I'm using this Tillamook butter, and it is especially yellow, but it's also just what happens when flour becomes hydrated. It's white before. Just even think of cookie dough. I mean, sometimes your sugar cookie dough, it's more of a yellow color naturally than it is white when it's that physical powder. Okay, so here's what the dough looks like when I'm all done. It comes together into one complete mass, but you can see it's not shaggy. It's not smooth. It's kind of shaggy. That's what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to wash my hands really quick just so I can show you this clean hand test that I was talking about. Then we'll be able to launch into some questions. After you mix this dough, it needs to be refrigerated for a minimum of 30 minutes. I prefer more like an hour if I am able to. And the wonderful thing is it can be made several days in advance. So if you like, you can actually make this 2 days ahead of using it. And with pie dough, one of my phrases is, when in doubt, chill it out. It just loves to be cold. This is why we're using cold butter. This is why we're using cold water. We want that dough to be cold at every step of the way. Okay, so as you can see now, I've got clean, dry hands. I am going to put my hand down on the dough and lift it up, and nothing comes up on my hands, okay? So if there was like stickiness or anything physically on my hands, we would know that this dough was possibly overhydrated, too wet, too sticky, okay? So I'm gonna wrap this tightly in plastic wrap, just put it in the refrigerator like this, like a disc, and it can stay in there for up to 2 days, and it can go into the freezer for up to 3 months. And you're just going to want to thaw it overnight in the refrigerator before you want to use it. Now, inside the book on pie, I go into way more detail about this. I have tons of beautiful step-by-step pictures. I also have an amazing episode of Bake It Up a Notch that's all about pie dough, and it's not just this kind. I also talk about dough in the food processor. I talk about cookie-style doughs that you can just press in that are a little less finicky. I talk about crusts that you can make with cooked grains like rice or quinoa. I have a crust in the book on pie that's made with nuts, and it's actually keto friendly. So there are so many possibilities, as I like to say. There's not just one right way to do anything. There are tons of right ways. Just in the book on pie alone, I think we have 50 different crust options. So please, please, please check those out. And now I can't wait to dive into some of these questions.
Awesome. And I really appreciate you answering questions in the chat as you went, because that was really helpful. The biggest question I'm seeing in the chat is what happens if it's overhydrated? Is it gone? Is it, what do you, can you save
Yep,
it?
there are some ways to save it. In the book on pie, I go into it in a little bit more detail, but with a too wet dough, one of the ways that you can sort of try to save it, a lot of pie dough recipes will tell you when you're rolling it out to only use a little bit of flour on your work surface.
Mhm.
Well, if you know your dough is too wet, you can kind of be generous with the flour on your work surface with the intention of the dough absorbing some of that flour. Now, normally we don't necessarily want to do that because if the dough is just right, extra flour might make it kind of dusty. It might kind of dry it out a little bit. But if you know your dough is already a little bit sticky and wet, just remember that you can use a little bit more flour, and that's one way we can sort of fix it. Another option is to enlist the help of my extra flaky method. That is a little bit more complex. It just involves rolling out the dough to about a half an inch thick and folding it in quarters. It's basically like a faux or simplified version of lamination, and it adds a little bit of structure and strength to the dough, as well as physically adding flaky layers. And if your dough is a little bit too wet, that can be another way you can incorporate more flour, is by rolling it out, folding it, letting it rest again. It'll allow for a little more flour to go in. Same thing, if your dough is a little bit too dry, you can kind of press or roll it out and just try that same technique of dipping your hand in cool water and flicking a few drops onto it, and then just folding it gently to incorporate. It's not necessarily going to do a ton of difference, but it's going to be enough that maybe it won't be as difficult for you to work with. And that's the main con of the dough being too dry. Too dry dough, when it bakes, it tastes pretty good still. It's not really a problem. The problem is it's very difficult to work with.
Mhm.
The too wet dough isn't as difficult to work with, but it doesn't taste as good. So if you're going to err towards one side or the other, I would err a little bit towards too dry.
And at the point where you put it in the fridge, could you freeze it, and for how long?
Yep, it can be frozen for up to 3 months in the freezer, and you'll just thaw it overnight in the refrigerator when you're ready to use it.
Okay. And I want to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A because I have a hard time catching them all in the chat. So how do you temper chocolate? We're not going to just talk about pie tonight.
I do have an entire episode about this. This is actually kind of one of my Achilles heels, if I'm being honest. I can still do it, but it was never my number one skill. But I have one of my best friends from pastry school is a candy maker. So I invited her onto an episode of my web series, and she showed me her method for tempering chocolate. She actually has a really unique method that uses the microwave. So it's really, really user friendly for people at home to try, a little less scary sometimes than balancing the double boiler on your stovetop and everything. So you can check that out. It's available on an episode of Bake It Up a Notch. If you just Google Bake It Up a Notch chocolate or Bake It Up a Notch candy, that'll come up for you. I think the other thing that I just encourage people when they're doing things like tempered chocolate is to remember to plan enough time to allow for patience with that stuff, because it doesn't always work perfectly the first time. And it just, even that extra 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that can really take what was supposed to be a fun, enjoyable baking experience into a frustrating experience. So just remember that it's not necessarily wrong or bad if your chocolate doesn't temper right the very first time. Like, that happens to even professional bakers and pastry chefs. So making sure that you just allow a little bit of time. And then also, don't be afraid to lean on little hacks and tricks. One trick that a lot of people don't know is that if you add just a little bit of shortening or coconut oil to your melted chocolate, it sort of becomes a little bit more like those candy melts that you can buy in stores. The difference is you're still using the quality of chocolate that you like. So that candy melt stuff, sometimes it doesn't really taste as good as chocolate. So you can still use a good quality chocolate and add a little bit of shortening or vegetable oil or coconut oil to it, and it will give it a little bit of a sheen when it sets, and it'll help it set a little bit firmer. So that's kind of a fun trick that not everyone knows.
I did not know that. So gluten-free. Do you have a specific flour that you use that's gluten-free? I love that you said that you had pie dough that was made out of all kinds of things, but like almond flour, gluten-free flours, things like that. Do you
Yep.
have any recommendations on how to make those the best pie doughs possible?
For sure. In fact, the book on pie is my most user-friendly in terms of dietary restrictions because it has a dairy-free dough, a vegan dough, a gluten-free dough, and a lot of the fillings are naturally vegan or gluten-free. So the whole point on the book on pie is that you can mix and match things. So you can choose the crust you want and choose the fillings and choose the toppings and all different things to kind of create your own pies if you want. I like Cup for Cup brand flour, which was created by a number of chefs as a good alternative replacement for all-purpose flour. But I also, in the book on pie, I do have an almond flour pie dough that's gluten-free. And one of my other favorite ones that's gluten-free that's really unique is a meringue pie crust. So that ends up to be a little bit more like a pavlova, your final bake, but it's really fun and it still slices like a pie. And then those nut and grain crusts that I mentioned as well. The grain crust sounds crazy. Like I wish I could go into it more right now, but basically you just combine any cooked grain, farro, quinoa, rice, anything you have left over with an egg white. And if you want a little bit of cheese, though you can also leave that out, the egg white proteins bind the grains, and then the starches in the grains help to form it together, and it becomes a sliceable, crisp crust. It's a great way to remix leftovers into something completely different. It's also a great way to make like a high protein or healthier pie crust because you can make a pie crust out of something like quinoa that has protein in it. It's really wonderful for quiches and things like that. I have a whole episode of Bake It Up a Notch on that, including the recipe, so you guys can check that out too.
I have to say that I love, and I mentioned this earlier, the savory pies. I just love it. And so I do have a question somewhere about that, but I'll get to it. Do eggs need to be at room temperature for baking?
Yes. So people don't like this answer because I really believe that they should. And in fact, I might regret showing you, but over there, you can see that's how many eggs I have at room temperature, guys, because I always am doing that. It was a special egg maker or egg holder that I had made to hold 3 dozen eggs because that is how many I typically keep out at room temperature because we're doing a lot of baking here. There is a way to quickly bring your eggs to room temperature. That is to just put them in some warm water for 5 to 10 minutes. And you can just do that on your counter if you forgot. Or if your house is really cold, that'll help take the chill off of them a little bit. And I just posted a tip on my Instagram just a couple days ago about how to soften butter if you forget to leave butter at room temperature too. So you can check out my Instagram for that little tip. It's very quick and easy.
Okay. Barbara's looking for a good recipe for a hamburger pie, like Marion's on the Cape. Help.
Yes. What's funny is I have not had that specific pie, but I am familiar with hamburger pie. I do not have exactly that recipe in either my savory baking book or in the book on pie, but I have several that are kind of close and also that you could probably mix and match to become that. There is sort of a ground beef and pepper and onion filling used in the enchilada pie in the book on pie. So you could definitely change that. There's also a really fun one inside savory baking. It's called the meat and potatoes pie. That one is a little bit more like a beef stew inside the pie. And then it gets topped with Duchess potatoes, which are those potatoes that you pipe and then they get crunchy on the outside. So what's so fun is it looks like toasted meringue, but it's actually like a totally savory pie. It's really, really cool. So while I don't have that specific one, I will take that as a recipe request and maybe I'll add that to my docket of recipes I'm going to develop because I do like a good hamburger pie and I've had one before. So
well, Barbara specifically said she wanted one without vegetables. So challenge.
Without vegetables. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Although I don't consider potatoes to be vegetable. I just consider them to be everything. So if somebody asks, what is better? Well, what's the difference between using a measuring cup versus a scale?
It's about accuracy. It's a difficult thing to share with people at home, but unless even different brands of measuring cups, you could put them side by side and then put them into bowls on a scale and you would find that they weigh different amounts. And that very thing is why we say it's just better to use a scale. Because if I tell you 180 grams or 1.5 cups, your 1.5 cups might actually be 195 grams, or it might actually be 170 grams. And I was telling you 180. So 10 grams, 20 grams, it doesn't always seem like that big of a difference. But when you're talking about smaller ingredients, things like baking powder, yeast, just a gram or two can actually make a really big difference. And a lot of times I think that the difficulties people have in baking at home come from their measurement systems, because if you're not being accurate with the measurements, then even if you followed the recipe to a T, it is not going to turn out just right. So remember, if you are using cup measures, that you should be spooning dry ingredients into the cup measure and then leveling it off at the top. If you just scoop into something like flour, you're going to be packing it in and you're not going to get an accurate measurement. So, and also remember, if you're going to use measuring cups versus weight, please use liquid measuring cups for liquid and dry measuring cups for dry, because they are actually set up to have more accuracy in those cases. If you try to pour liquid into a dry measuring cup, again, you could end up with a pretty off measure.
It's amazing to me historically that people were able to bake so well, given that, as we were talking about earlier before we got started, that our grandmas would just grab any old cup and measure.
Well, and certainly like some of the things that I've read are about handfuls. And that's the thing, is that your hand is different than size than my hand. But if I'm the one making it, I know how many handfuls I need to make the biscuits right, or to make the pie dough right, or to make, so that's, one of the things that's changed in kind of the food world is that it's really only been in the last, 40 plus years that we've really learned how to and honed in on how to write a good recipe. So many people that were writing recipes before, they maybe were great cooks and they had a great knowledge and a great recipe, but they weren't necessarily great at translating that. So it's definitely important.
Yeah, it's definitely a skill. Erin asks about butter. European versions, are they better for pie because they have a higher fat content?
Yes. So European butter typically has a fat content of around 82%. American butters usually come in around 80%. Now, 2% doesn't seem like that big of a difference, but basically what it equates to is that American butters contain more moisture, and that means that they're firmer when they're chilled. And European butters contain less moisture, and that means that they're more likely to melt in your hands also, because they do have that higher fat content. So just something to think about. Sometimes when you're using American butters, they can be kind of crumbly. Tillamook, the butter that I use, is American, but it has 81% fat. So it's right in the middle of the two. So it's priced more like an American butter, but it does have more fat. So it's a little less expensive than the European butters. It's been my favorite for a few years, but really, I used to say for years that I used whichever butter I could find on sale. So I was using so much of it that I just was going to use whichever one I could get my hands on. So like I said, big believer that there's lots of right ways, and sometimes the butter that's on sale is the right way to go.
I love it. So Rita says that she is dairy free. And what is your top substitute recommendation for butter or cream?
Cream is harder. Cream, there isn't as great of, it's still possible. I use usually coconut cream in replace of cream. I'll also sometimes use like evaporated coconut milk is another option, because they take some of the moisture off. So it's a little bit thicker, more like cream is, and coconut is naturally fatty. Cream is a harder one for me to talk about replacing. Butter is a little bit easier, especially in pie dough. I like to use a shortening. I prefer a non-hydrogenated shortening. The brand Spectrum is the one that I use the most. You can get that at a lot of different grocery stores, especially stores that have natural food products. I don't typically recommend the butter flavored alternatives. A lot of those contain things that actually raise the melting point, lower the melting point. So one of the wonderful things about shortening, and lots of people were asking that in the comments before, shortening has a higher melting point than butter. So that's why a lot of people use it in pie dough and biscuits, because it's easier to have success, because it's less likely to melt in your hands. It's less likely to melt out of the crust in the oven, because it takes quite a higher temperature for the shortening to start to melt than butter. But shortening is missing one thing that butter has in spades, which is flavor.
Mm-hmm.
So if you understand the technique, you can make a really good pie dough with all butter. You can also make a wonderful pie dough with all shortening. So shortening based pie doughs are usually very flaky because of that higher melting point. I also like to use lard, and that's a really good dairy-free option. That doesn't work for everyone who's dairy-free, because sometimes dairy-free people are also vegan, and then they don't want to use lard. But lard makes for a very flavorful and flaky crust. It's also for people who keep it on hand for some types of cooking. For example, I know someone who always has lard on hand because they make a lot of tamales and they make a lot of masa-based products. So if you have lard on hand, it makes for a great pie dough too. So in the book on pie, I actually talk about all different kinds of fats that you can use. I talk about oil. I talk about peanut butter. I talk about cream cheese. There are so many different things that you can do. I really want people to kind of think outside the box when it comes to this stuff, because again, once you master a technique, a mixing method, that's when you can really start to get creative with it and make it your own.
Mm-hmm. Erin, we have a ton of questions, and for people that are here, I just want to let you know that we'll try to get to as many as we can. Teresa asks, she's seen people put baking powder in Crisco. Why would somebody do that?
Baking powder in Crisco?
Into the flour prior to adding. Oh no, I'm sorry. They put baking powder in flour prior to adding Crisco. Why would somebody?
Sometimes people, I don't agree with that method, if I'm being honest. Some people think that adding a small amount of a chemical leavener like baking powder or baking soda will help to make the crust flakier. Baking powder in particular usually needs either heat or acid or both to activate it. And there is no acid in pie dough unless you're actively adding an ingredient like vinegar, which is a hack that some people do. So I personally don't do that, but just on an interesting point, I do add a small amount of baking powder to my streusel recipe, like my crumb topping that I use on top of pies or for bar cookies. And I add it for that very reason, that I think it makes slightly bigger clumps in the streusel. So you get more of those like little bits. I don't think, personally, I do not think it's necessary in pie dough to do that.
Okay. A bunch of people have asked, what happens if you overwork your dough?
I want to actually encourage people that overworking the dough, it's not that it's impossible to do, but I think that actually recipes have been encouraging us for so long to barely mix the dough, mix it only until it comes together. And frankly, that's a little bit of, I don't like this phrase. I need to come up with something better for this, old wives' tale, because that's what a horrible phrase. But it's not really true. Example, when I do this method of rolling out the dough and folding it, I'm actually putting so much more work in the dough, and it actually only makes the dough easier to handle and more tender in the end. The key to not having your dough be tough is to make sure it rests enough. So if you work it a lot, if it takes you a while to get the dough mixed together, I would worry less about making the dough tough and make sure that you're just giving it enough refrigerator time on the back end. When we work the dough, we develop gluten. And gluten is not a bad thing, but it is these protein strands that form together. And when they form tight strands, they're really tight like this. And when we refrigerate the dough, the strands relax. And that makes the dough easier to work out. It makes it less likely to shrink. So whenever you handle the dough, if it takes you a little bit longer than you think it should, just make sure you chill it for an extra 30 minutes and you're really going to be fine. I think that's something that people misunderstand about dough. They're like, oh, I only should mix it just a tiny bit. Really, you can mix it. You can be pretty generous with it as long as you give it enough of that rest time.
So actually, that comes up. Megan asks about that exact same thing. That she gets a lot of shrinkage in her blind bake when I blind bake my pie. And so, would that be the thing to do? Is let it rest more?
Well, that certainly helps, but actually with blind baking and par baking specifically, so just brief, I'm horrible at answering these questions quickly. This is not a lightning round. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Par baking stands for partially baking the crust. That's something you would use when the filling requires baking. So for pecan pie or pumpkin pie, we would par bake. Blind baking is when you fully bake the crust, and that's usually when the filling doesn't require baking. So something like chocolate cream pie or coconut cream pie, lemon meringue, that kind of thing. Typically, people's crusts shrink because they don't use enough pie weights. This is a huge misunderstanding, and it's partially because of the horrible way that pie weights are sold. They're sold in a little package like this at stores like Williams Sonoma, but you need enough weights to fill your pie dish all the way to the top edge. Excuse me, everyone. If you don't fill your pie plate all the way to the top edge, you're not supporting the sides of the crust. You're only weighing down the base. And when the sides aren't supported and it hits the heat of the oven, that's when it's going to be likely to shrink. The same thing can happen even outside of par and blind baking if you don't use enough filling. If we pour our filling in and it only comes halfway up the crust, the same thing can happen. So a lot of people don't understand that, and they think it's because they overworked their dough, so it shrunk. Now, with that said, if you go to roll out your dough and every time you're rolling it out, it's shrinking before you even put it in the oven, that is usually a sign that it has not had enough resting or relaxing time. So just put it back in the fridge, give it some more time, and it should start to behave for you.
Can you do that after you've already rolled it out?
Yep, just make sure you cover it with plastic wrap or a clean kitchen towel, because as the dough sits in the refrigerator, it can start to dry out, and we just don't want it to be cracking or having problems with that as we're working with it.
Okay. Just really quick too, Erin, I'm not asking you to rush. I just want to let people know that we're going to get to as many questions as possible. Do you have a preference for Crisco versus butter?
Personally, butter all the way for everything. Butter, baby. And even, shortening though is how I learned to make pie dough. So for beginners or for people who've tried a butter pie dough and are having a lot of problems, switch to shortening until you get that method down. And then you can even do half shortening, half butter, and still get a little of that butter flavor and a little of that ease from the shortening. So like I said, there's lots of right ways to do things.
I love that. And I also love the crispiness you get from the Crisco with baking. We actually, well, anyways, I want to get back to questions. Susan asks, and I think a bunch of other people do you prefer glass, ceramic, or metal pans for baking?
My personal favorite in order: metal, ceramic, glass. Okay, glass is my least favorite. It's the worst conductor of heat. It does the worst job of browning the crust. The only real advantage to glass is that you can actually look at it and see, is my crust browning? How's it looking? But glass is my least favorite. Ceramic is good. It conducts heat a little bit better. And as long as it has a glossy interior, it should usually be pretty non-stick. Metal is my favorite because it's the most non-stick, so it's the easiest to complete my favorite, the sturdy pie challenge, where you lift an entire pie out of the pie plate, and it's very fun and exciting. It's the #1 party trick. And metal also is nice and thin, so it allows things to brown really evenly rather than kind of spotty. One other option that a lot of people don't think of, but I encourage people to check out cast iron pie pans. They're available sometimes in the camping section of stores. They're usually, not terribly expensive. And also, in lieu of that, a cast iron skillet, because similarly, the cast iron retains a lot of heat. It's really good at getting that crust browned. Really excellent for that.
For the metal pans, would you prefer lighter or darker ones?
My favorite pan comes from USA Pan, and I would actually say it would be considered a lighter metal pan, but it's sort of in between. Like, it's not really as dark as some dark pans are, and it's not really as light as some light pans are. It honestly doesn't really matter. The thickness of the metal would be more important. My favorite one is from USA Pan. It retails at like $14.99, so it's a pretty easy option. And you guys can check it out for the color reference and kind of the thickness of the metal. But lots of metal works. Even disposable aluminum pie plates work pretty well. For that same reason, they're thin. They allow the crust to really brown evenly.
Matthew asks, do you have a preference for pastry flour or all-purpose?
It completely depends on the use. So for pie dough, I'm using all-purpose typically. Pastry flour has a much lower protein content than all-purpose. So all-purpose is usually between 8 to 10%, and pastry flour is more like 5 to 7%. You can absolutely make pie dough with pastry flour. The most important thing to remember is lower protein content means less moisture will be required. So with a pastry flour, you're going to need less water than you will with all purpose, because we have less protein. And that's the same reason why if you were to use a whole wheat flour, you're going to need way more water, because there's way more protein in a whole wheat flour.
Mm-hmm. Lisa asks, do you have any cookie baking tips?
Ooh, yes, lots. So many. Actually,
What's your favorite?
I have, I was going to say next week, I'm teaching a free virtual cooking class with Food 52. So you can actually look that up and join us for that if you're interested. I'm going to be making, like, with one sugar cookie recipe, I'm going to be showing different things you can do to it. And that's one of my favorite things to do this time of year, is to kind of have one really good, reliable recipe, and then maybe I'll roll some of them in sprinkles, and maybe I'll dye some of them and make little swirly marbled cookies, and kind of give different cookies different treatments, so that when I put them in a cookie box, we have lots of different arrangements, but also that I didn't necessarily have to whip out 10 completely different recipes. So that's one of my tips, is to kind of lean on your favorites, and then you can make a cookie box that still has a lot of options in it.
Love it. Doris asks, why does her butter come out of her crust while she's baking? What's the problem there?
Yes, that's a common issue. And so again, the first thing I'm going to recommend, Doris, is that if you've had this trouble consistently, maybe try making pie one time with shortening, just so you can get the hang of it, because that is less likely to happen. This is one of the downsides of using all butters. It's slightly less friendly to work with. When the fat melts out of the crust in the oven, it's for one of two reasons, okay? Either the temperature, or it's a temperature issue, or it has to do with the way the fat itself is incorporated. Now, the temperature part is easier to understand. If your oven isn't hot enough, or if your dough hasn't chilled for long enough, that is one time when the fat can melt out of the crust. Because basically, if we put a room temperature dough into a really hot oven, what does the fat in the dough want to do? It wants to melt, okay? But if we put a really cold dough in the oven, well, we get that little moisture evaporation. We don't get the fat melting. So sometimes it means that your oven is running not hot enough. Even if you've chilled it long enough, but you put it in and the butter melts out, you might want to run to the hardware store. They're usually only about $8. Grab yourself an oven thermometer. Put it in your oven, put it in a few different places in your oven, and see if it's reading true to the temperature you're setting your oven to. It's actually incredibly common for home ovens to fall out of calibration. And I have helped so many people realize that their ovens are anywhere between 25 to like 75 degrees off of what they think they are. So please check that out. It's really easy. If your oven is under warranty, call the oven company and they will have someone come and recalibrate it for you. That should be covered in the warranty. If it's out of warranty, just use the oven thermometer and adjust accordingly.
Mm-hmm. So Ellen just put the link for your cookie class in the
Ellen, that's so great. Yes.
Probably going to get about, I don't know, 300 signups in the next 10 minutes.
I'd love to see you all there. That would be so much fun. Let's do this again next week, guys.
I would love to. I want to ask a couple of questions about your process, because Amelia has the same question I do. How do you come up with an original recipe, especially for classic recipes like pie? Like what's the process there?
Well, it's multifaceted. So one of the things is, your personal preference and your personal taste weighs into it. So sometimes I'll think, I love key lime pie, but I always wish it was tartar. It's always so sweet. And so then I kind of set out to make one that has like a less sweet, more tart kind of situation. And something like that could guide me. Something people don't realize is that you can't actually copyright a recipe. So because of that, I start with recipes just with a basic knowledge of baking ratios. So I've been baking, you mentioned that I've been baking since I was 14. That's when I got really into it, but I've been baking for even longer, if you can believe it.
Wow.
But it wasn't until I got my first job in a bakery at 16 that I really learned that those ratios were everything. So for example, if I wanted to do a scone, I already know the ratio in my head of fat to flour, about how much sugar I would need, about how much liquid I would need. I know that adding an egg would change the texture in this way, or I could leave it out. So by knowing those things inherently, that's the jumping off point. I usually sit down and I kind of sketch it out based on a ratio. I head into the kitchen and I make it. And usually as I'm making it, I'll see if it's going to be able to work or not. And I'll just make adjustments as I go. Sometimes I test a recipe and it only takes 2 or 3 times to get it just right before I send it off to someone to retest it. And other times I work on recipes for years and years and years. And, it really is just kind of how important it is to me to get it just right. And also whatever's inspiring it, kind of guiding it. I think a lot of times the seasons are one of my biggest sources of inspiration, and also people that I know, because I'll think, oh, so and so really loves black raspberries. How can I make a black raspberry dessert? And so it just kind of goes off like that. But definitely, inspiration comes from lots of places. And for me, it starts with the science. It starts with those ratios, and that's what I can use to start playing around and getting it just right.
I have 3 more questions for you, unless we have more time, and I'll ask a 4th one.
I mean, and I can go an extra 15 minutes if we want to get these questions banged out. Let's do it.
Okay.
How many baking friends do we have here? Like 240 baking friends. Let's not let anyone down. Let's keep this going.
We still have like 42 questions. I don't think we'll get to them all, but if we could have 15 minutes, I think.
Yeah, let's do 15 more. Yep.
My question, Erin, is you've been on food shows. Do they waste a lot of food? Because they make all this stuff and like 1 or 2 judges eats it. Then what happens to the rest of the food?
You don't realize just how large these crews are. So the crews themselves are sometimes made up of as many as 60 different people. So there's a lot of people just there to eat cakes and eat different things as well. They all have families. They have people they can take it to. I didn't have as much of a visual experience of what happened to the food on Nailed It, I confess, because there has to be very specific separation between the mentors and the contestants. We're only allowed to see them when a lot of prize money is on the line. There are very specific legal rules. So basically, we were escorted to set by somebody and then escorted off set. And I was not allowed to linger or mingle or do anything like that. I always had to wait kind of off stage. On my own sets for my own web series and stuff, if there are not enough people there that I'm working with to physically eat it, I typically make other arrangements. So, for example, I just shot a cookbook recently, and I contacted a local food insecurity group, and they picked up the cakes every other day and started distributing them to different places around town. Sometimes they give them to volunteers. That's another thing that I used to love to do. I had a firehouse in my neighborhood when I lived in New Jersey. I would go to they could eat so much. I would go and I'd bring like 4 cakes to the firehouse, gone.
Yeah.
And I also like to take them to like senior living communities. Sometimes I had one in New Jersey that also they asked me to please only come once a week because many people had diabetes and I was not helping that. But it's really lovely because also when I would take them to senior living centers, they would always be really, really honest with their feedback. So when I was working on books, I really liked to take things there and be like, do you like this? Do you not? Does it, and I just would get so much feedback that way. Whereas the firefighters usually just ate it and said thanks. They didn't give a lot of feedback.
I love it. I love that you give back in that way. So Melissa has a question about how do you start a career in baking and being an author? Do you think pastry school is the best way, or is there other avenues?
Well, it was certainly the best way for me. Like that's what I did. So it worked for me. And one of the things I liked about pastry school is it gave me that knowledge of the fundamentals, the science, the ratios. It gave me exposure to a lot of different pastry chefs who were my instructors. So normally another way that you can learn and get a lot of experience in this industry without going to pastry school or culinary school is to work in a lot of different kitchens. One of the things that pastry school gives you is, you have a different teacher every, 3 weeks or so. So you still get that exposure to lots of different styles and lots of different backgrounds. Some of my teachers were French and were training me in a more traditional French style, and others, had owned their own business. And so you started to get all of these different kind of views and perspectives that were really interesting. I have pastry chef friends who are authors who did not go to pastry school, and I did. And so I can say that you definitely can do it both ways. And especially one of my goals with my web series, Bake It Up a Notch, was to bring a level of education to people who couldn't afford pastry school, and try to teach some of the things that I learned there. So like with the resources that are available online nowadays, I certainly don't think you necessarily have to. I went to the Culinary Institute of America. It was everything. I loved it. I still talk about it all the time. I went to the Hyde Park, New York campus. And then I worked there for about 5 years after I graduated in their cookbook department, where I learned more about how to work on cookbooks. So that was how I kind of got into this industry. And what's interesting is from a very young age, I loved writing and I loved baking. And it was like I figured out that I could put those together and maybe make a career. I wasn't 100% sure that it was going to work, but that was why I went to pastry school, was the hopes of bringing those together. So while I was in school, I did freelance writing gigs. I wrote for websites and little indie magazines, and I wrote for the school newspaper and all of those things. Anywhere that would let me say anything, I was trying to say it. and then social media. It was not my intention to use social media in this way, but social media became a way to share my work, which is very visual. And that ended up being how I got my book deal, was because I had a social media following. And so those things are a great way to kind of promote yourself and kind of get into that industry. And also, even if you don't want to get into the industry, if it's just something you enjoy, it's a way that you can share and connect with a community of people who enjoy the same things. I also say that the downside of social media is that it puts us all in this situation where we're comparing ourselves to other people all the time. So I really try to encourage people to have a healthy perspective about all of those things. That wasn't my intention. My intention wasn't to get one little number up when I started posting. I was just making cakes and hoping that people liked it. And I think that when you kind of follow that method with it and just do things that make yourself happy, it's such a wonderful outlet. And the moment you start trying to please other people or any kind of computer algorithm, it's going to be a lot more harmful than fun. So that's my one little soapbox about using that, as we all have experienced, I'm sure.
Well, I love your Instagram page, and I want to remind people that Erin has a new YouTube channel. So make sure to check that out, because we just want to see you all the time, Erin.
Oh, thank you.
Samantha asked, what's the best way to thaw frozen pie dough?
In the refrigerator is the best way, and it's best to give it like a full 24 hours in the fridge to thaw. If you want it to thaw quicker, you can make it thinner than I did here. So this is about an inch thick. You can make it more like a half an inch or a quarter inch thick, and then it's going to thaw faster. It's also going to take up a wider footprint in your freezer. So just things like that to consider.
Okay, well, we have very sad people in the chat because your cookie class is sold out.
No, I didn't know it had a cap. I wouldn't have teased you that way. I thought it was like unlimited.
Oh, okay, a few people got in. A few people got in. So
okay, good.
Can you use vegetable shortening instead of Crisco?
Yes, in fact, that is what I typically use. I use Spectrum brand, which is a vegetable shortening. I use that over Crisco.
Okay. And April says, I saw an episode where you put a metal bowl in the microwave. Is that allowed?
Yes. And again, I fully understand if you don't want to do that. Do not, it can go awry if you don't do it right. Metal in the microwave is only bad if it touches the sides of the microwave in any way. So as long as your bowl is small enough that it will stay in the center of the microwave, it's completely fine. The reason that we did that in that particular episode is because the metal will retain heat. So if we used another microwave safe material like tempered glass, or even like a plastic that you knew was microwave safe, any of those things, as soon as you take it out of the microwave, it is at room temperature. Whereas metal, it keeps some of that heat in. So specifically when tempering chocolate, it keeps the chocolate warm while we're agitating it, and that is helpful. If that method scares you, just do it over a double boiler on the stovetop. It's the same thing. We can use a metal bowl, we can apply heat to it, and we can have more control. I definitely don't want anyone setting any sparks off in their microwave. And like I said, that's my friend Evan's technique. If it didn't work so dang well, we tried so many things, it really does work the best. It's the easiest for people at home to emulate. You can still do that method though with a glass bowl, it's okay. So if metal just freaks you out, please don't stop. If leaving eggs at room temperature freaks you out, leave them in the fridge. I understand. It's your kitchen. You should do it the way you want to.
I like that. Can you use eggs in pie crust?
Interesting question. It's typically not in a standard pastry dough. So the main reason is eggs are protein and also additional fat. So there's already a very high ratio of fat in a pie dough, pretty much 1-to-1 fat to flour, more or less. So also adding an egg is adding additional moisture. I usually would only use an egg in more of a cookie style crust. So something that's a little bit denser, like not flaky. And I have several cookie style crusts in the book on pie and one in savory baking, and they use an egg, but I don't usually use an egg in a pastry style crust.
Okay. Do you have a specific pie crust that you would use for like a pot pie?
Yes, I mean, honestly, for pot pie, I love my rough puff pastry as well. Because pot pie, if we're only putting crust on the top, I feel like we want a lot of crust, so we want extra flakiness. My pot pie recipes are not, they have bottom crust and top crust because I can't leave well enough alone. But rough puff pastry would be really, really fun for that. And just remember that that's really flaky. A lot of people get scared of the idea of making puff pastry at home, but my rough puff pastry recipe is exactly the same as my pie dough recipe, and we just enlist a couple of those folds. So if you can make this, you can make rough puff pastry, and man, it kicks the butt of anything you find in the freezer section, let me tell you.
I'm all over that. I love pot pie. Seuss asks, if you make more than one pie at a time and want to freeze a pie, do you recommend baking the pie before you freeze it?
I'm working on this right now, actually. I'll tell you what I have discovered so far, but I'm not fully ready to share all of my results yet. I believe that with fruit pies and custard pies freeze pretty well once you've baked them, okay? They both refresh pretty well. Custard pies, what I mean by that are like pumpkin, pecan. Those actually freeze surprisingly well and retain their texture really well. What I mean by refreshing them is anytime you freeze a baked pie, when you thaw it, the crust is going to absorb some of the moisture from the filling. It's going to happen no matter what you do. So being able to put it back in the oven, tented in foil, can sometimes allow some of that moisture to be gone and kind of re-crisp the crust a little bit, bring it back to what it was like before. It's not as, there's also pies that are meant to be frozen, things like ice cream pies or pudding pies, cream pies, they often freeze fairly well. Unfortunately, I'm still kind of experimenting with this, so I can't give you any hard and fast rules. But this is something I'm actually hoping to provide in my newest book that I'm working on. I've just begun, so I can't tell you anything else about it yet because I've just gotten started, but I'm working on a lot of freezing instructions and refreshing things. And the idea that if you spent a weekend baking, that you could put some of it in the freezer and save it for another day rather than feeling like you have to give away 3 dozen baked goods one weekend.
It sounds like something you've done with all those eggs sitting on your counter.
Yes, definitely. My neighbors really like me, it turns out.
Oh gosh, I would love for you to live in my neighborhood. Christine asks, what do you think about the hot water pie crust technique for savory pies or small English meat pies? I find this technique works for me over cold pie crust techniques.
Hot water crust is fantastic. I have a recipe for it in the book on pie. I also have a recipe for it available online at Food 52. I have several savory pies that use it. Hot water crust is the definition of a mealy crust. So when I'm talking about a flakier crust versus a mealy crust, mealy has like an unpleasant connotation, like a mealy apple, no good. Mealy crust, this is not a bad thing. It just means it's denser, it's not as flaky. And again, dense doesn't mean that it's tough. It just means that the crumb structure isn't as light and airy, it's tighter, okay? So hot water crust has a really firm crust. There's not really flakes. And what's wonderful about it is that it's very sturdy. It holds up to really tall pies, really wet fillings. That's why it's so wonderful for savory pies. I still really enjoy it, and I have recipes for it in my book online. It's not my favorite. I love a flaky crust, but it really just depends on what you're going for. And for people who have difficulty with a flaky crust, hot water crust is almost impossible to mess up. Like it works really great every single time. So it's definitely a really reliable one.
I like that. Several people have asked how to prevent a soggy bottom pie.
So, so sorry, another cough. I normally have water nearby and I didn't do that this time. So exactly. So once I start talking for this long, I'm like, I'm parched. So one of the biggest ways to avoid a soggy bottom is properly baking the pie. So for a double crust pie, that means baking it long enough. My biggest tip is that if your pie is starting to brown more than you'd like, you can tent it with foil, but you can also lower the oven temperature. Like I start my apple pies at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, but once they've started to brown, I put foil on the top and I lower the temperature to 375. That way, it's browning less intensely, but it's still, remember that things bake from the outside in.
Mm-hmm.
So if we want the crust to not only be soggy on the outside and we want it to be not soggy all the way in that center part, we want to give it enough time in the oven. For single crust pies, baking it sufficiently usually means par or blind baking. I actually par bake any single crust pie that has a filling that will be baked again. Cherry, apple, anything that is a single crust pie. If the filling requires oven time, I will be par baking it, because it's very difficult for the filling to, it's very difficult for the crust to get baked in the time it takes for a filling to get set in a single crust pie. The reason that it's okay in a double crust pie is that they just take longer to bake. They're bigger. They have two crusts. It takes longer for that heat to penetrate all the way to the center.
All makes sense. I love this next question. A couple of people have asked it. Can they use vodka instead of water in their pie crust recipe?
Yes, this is a popular hack. It was popularized by Cooks Illustrated magazine years ago. It definitely works. In my house, I save vodka for drinking. It's definitely possible to make a great pie crust without adding vodka to the crust. However, adding vodka definitely works. And here's why. The vodka evaporates faster in the heat of the oven than water does, which makes for a crisper crust. It also makes it harder to overhydrate your dough, because if it does get a little bit overhydrated, it usually evaporates off in the oven, leaving it crisp and tender. Most people don't use vodka for the full amount of the water. They usually just add like a tablespoon or two of vodka and then use the rest as water. But it's up to you. Another thing that will do this, it's slightly different, and it does add a slight bit of flavor, is vinegar. Vinegar will contribute to a more tender crust. It will also evaporate out a little differently, leaving that consistency.
Mm-hmm. I know we're not going to have time for you to roll out the pie dough, but what advice do you have for people so it doesn't rip?
Well, if it's hydrated properly, the ripping shouldn't happen. So when your dough tears or cracks, that's usually the number one sign of underhydration. So if it's doing that, you can always do what we said, add a few flicks of moisture, fold it together, refrigerate it for 30 minutes and try again. But as long as the dough is properly hydrated, it shouldn't crack. What I recommend for rolling out is start your rolling pin in the center of the dough and push away from you, then come back to the center of the dough and push towards you. It'll feel a little bit awkward at first, but what most people do by just rolling back and forth like this is they make the center thinner and they leave the outer edge really thick, and it's just not even. So for the most even results, start in the middle, push away, come to the middle, push towards you. And as you get better at that, you can kind of do it as one smooth motion. But at the beginning, I really encourage people to try it that way. It makes a big difference.
Okay. What is your favorite pie to eat and to make?
I love making cream pies because I think that people are like, one of my goals as a baker is, when you give a kid a birthday cake, like from the store, it doesn't have to be homemade, and their face lights up. I'm trying to make as many adults do that in my life as possible. So, and it's hard because adults don't want to get excited the same way a kid wants to get excited. Adults do not always want to give into that. So when you make cream pies and they're towering with whipped cream and they slice so beautifully and I can hold the pie like this, adults go wide-eyed. And so that's why I love making them the most. They're sort of like fairy tale pies. They're just perfect. My favorite pies to eat are fruit pies. Specifically, I kind of have a different favorite for every season. So like in the spring, I love a pure rhubarb pie. In the summer, any kind of stone fruit, or my roasted strawberry pie, which is probably one of my top 3 all-time favorite pies. It's in the book on pie. In the fall, I love Concord grape pie. That has a very short season, but it's probably my favorite fruit pie of all time. And then in the winter, I mean, just a classic apple, because we can still get apples all winter long. So I love fruit pies. Like, fruit pies are why I fell in love with pie. But I think even people who don't love pie like cream pies. That's what I've found. So it's like I can find a pie that everyone will like, even if they say they're not a pie person.
Mhm. I do love cream pies as well as peach pies. Any kind of peach cobbler, I'm all over it. I
Yes.
have one last question for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Who is your chef inspiration?
Oh gosh, so many. That's such a hard question because I there's truly so many. Growing up, I was a really big fan of Rose Levy Berenbaum, who wrote the book The Cake Bible.
Mhm.
Now I have the pleasure to work with her quite a bit. I've done the food styling for her last several books, so she's become a colleague as well as a mentor of mine. I'm endlessly inspired by Julia Child. I never had the pleasure of meeting her, but Julia specifically wanting to teach people and having a good attitude about mistakes in the kitchen, because we learn so much from the mistakes. That is something that literally inspires every single thing that I do. So that is a driving force in like absolutely everything I'm doing. So I can't not say her. A lot of my people that are like in right in this field with me, I love Stella Parks. I already mentioned her name. Claire Saffitz, Yossi Arafi, Samantha Senaveratney. My friend Erin Clarkson has an incredible blog, and she does really amazing stuff. So there is no end to people that I'm really, really inspired by. Oh, and one other one I will say, Donna Hay, who is sort of the Martha Stewart of Australia, for
Mhm.
those of you who do not know. Her work, her magazines, the books that she's put out, those have been inspiring me for my entire career. And for anyone who has Disney Plus, she has a new holiday special on Disney Plus. So if you're not familiar with her, you could check her out for the first time, because I just love everything she does. She is the coolest.
Well, I think you're the coolest. So, and I think a lot of people here would agree with me.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
I know we went over a little bit, but thank you so much for answering so many of our questions and just making this so accessible to people who are excellent bakers and who are beginning bakers. I really, really appreciate your time tonight.
Of course, my pleasure. I love seeing all those hearts. So I heart all of you back. And at the end of everything I do, I like to wish people happy baking. So as you all carry forth into this holiday season, wishing you happy holidays and lots of happy baking.
That's right. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Thank you, Erin.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.